In 1945, as World War II ended, George C. Marshall stood at the absolute center of American military power. He held enough power to make even dictators salivate. Over 4 years, he had overseen the expansion of the U.S. Army from fewer than 200,000 soldiers to over 8 million, a force larger than any democracy had ever fielded in human history. He selected theater commanders, coordinated Allied grand strategy, and ensured the United States could wage war on multiple continents simultaneously. He already held 5-star rank, and Washington wanted to give him more. As the Cold War began to crystallize, discussions emerged about whether Marshall should remain as a permanent central military authority. Nuclear weapons had fundamentally altered the nature of power. Soviet expansion was accelerating. Some argued that peacetime now required sustained military leadership, that the institutional structure built for total war should be preserved to meet the atomic age. The argument was compelling. The timing was perfect. Marshall had every justification in the world to say yes. He was the most powerful general on the planet. He had just won the biggest war in human history. The entire apparatus of American military power answered to him. Marshall looked at all of it, the power, the prestige, the argument, and said no. He understood the structural danger in accepting too much power. Wartime had required enormous centralization, unified command, and streamlined decision-making. The centralization was functional, even necessary when facing existential threats. But demobilization required the opposite. If a single general remained elevated in peacetime, that rank could quietly evolve into political gravity. The line between military advisor and military ruler would start to blur. And once that happened, there was no clean way back. History had seen what happened when that line disappeared. Marshall had studied it. He wasn't going to be the American version of it. Marshall had no interest in becoming the permanent military figure of the atomic age. Instead of consolidating authority, he stepped away from uniformed command entirely and accepted civilian appointments, Secretary of State, then Secretary of Defense, deliberately separating military prestige from executive influence. The greatest threat to the system he'd spent his life defending wasn't an enemy abroad. It was unchecked power at home. The most powerful general in America chose to make himself smaller. That's what made him great. In 1951, Matthey Ridgway inherited command of a retreating army facing aggressive Chinese offensive along the 38th parallel. Morale and positions were in shambles. Units were losing cohesion faster than they could be reinforced. He walked into that disaster and turned it around. Ridgway reimposed discipline, restored operational cohesion, and stabilized the front through sheer force of leadership and tactical clarity. When President Truman dismissed Douglas MacArthur for insubordination, igniting a political firestorm that nearly consumed the administration, Ridgway was elevated to Supreme Commander in the Far East. He was now the most prominent general on Earth. The man who had just saved the Korean front was being handed MacArthur's throne. Washington floated the idea of making it official, reviving the 5-star rank, elevating him visibly, sending a signal of resolve to allies and adversaries alike. It was framed as necessity, the kind of offer most men spend their entire careers dreaming about. Ridgway said no. He understood the implications with cold clarity. Expanding ranks during a limited war would have made it look like the military was gaining political influence. Korea was not a global war. Command authority needed to remain operational, not inflated. Ridgway had watched what had happened to MacArthur up close. He'd seen exactly how the story ended when a general starts believing his own mythology. MacArthur had been the most celebrated soldier in the world, worshipped by the public, feared by his enemies, untouchable by anyone, and Truman fired him like a mid-level bureaucrat. He wasn't going to make the same mistake. Ridgway chose to operate within the existing structure, holding to a principle that every general had to learn. Genuine authority comes from competence and results, not from additional stars on a collar. Power that has to announce itself isn't power. It's insecurity with a uniform on. Ridgway already had the power. He just refused to wear it on his sleeve. After the Mexican-American War, Winfield Scott became one of the most celebrated military leaders in American history. His strategic victories had secured vast territorial gains for the United States. Congress awarded him the brevet rank of Lieutenant General, the first American to hold that grade since George Washington. at a time when European powers routinely elevated successful generals into permanent elite military classes with hereditary titles and entrenched privileges. The door was wide open. All he had to do was walk through it. American politics floated the idea of further solidifying Scott's prestige through expanded formal military status. The precedents already existed. European armies had kings, princes, and marshals whose rank went beyond the battlefield and became permanent power. Scott had the popularity, the reputation, and the political capital to pursue something similar. Nobody would have stopped him. Nobody could have. He was the most famous living American soldier. The public adored him. Politicians courted him. But he looked at what America actually was, and what it could become. Scott recognized that pre-Civil War America was politically fragile in ways that made European models dangerous. Tensions were rising. Slavery was fracturing the national consensus. The balance between federal authority and state sovereignty was increasingly contested. Elevating military rank could fracture the already fragile Union. One wrong move, one general positioning himself above the civilian structure, and the fault lines already splitting the country could crack wide open. The Civil War was only 9 years away. He could see it coming before almost anyone else did. When he later pursued the presidency in 1852, he did so through civilian candidacy, submitting himself to the electoral process like any other candidate, not through military leverage or demands for additional structural authority. The campaign failed, but he set forth a principle that outlasted him. He chose to be known for his service, and set precedent in America. Military prestige should never overpower civilian will. In 1947, as the United States Air Force became an independent branch, Carl Spaatz became its first chief of staff. The branch he now led controlled intercontinental striking power, capable of destroying entire cities in hours. Strategic bombing and nuclear weapons had permanently altered the scale of conflict. Conventional ground forces seemed almost irrelevant compared to the apocalyptic potential he now commanded. One decision from his office could trigger a chain of events that ended civilization as it existed. The case for elevation was stronger than it had ever been for any general before him. There were conversations within defense circles about whether Air Force leadership should receive elevated rank structures to reflect this new strategic dominance. The argument had surface logic. The Air Force was no longer a supporting arm. It was the primary instrument of deterrence, the ultimate guardian of national security. Shouldn't the man holding that instrument hold something more? Shouldn't the weight of the office match the weight of the weapon? It was a reasonable question, and in any other area, the answer might have been yes. Spaatz shut it down. He understood that nuclear authority already carried immense psychological and political weight. The ability to order strikes that could incinerate millions, more casualties than the entire Second World War in a matter of hours, created a burden unlike anything previous commanders had borne. Further expanding personal rank would only concentrate symbolic power into one office, making that authority appear more monarchical than operational. In the nuclear age, a military that looked monarchical was existentially dangerous. So instead of reaching for more, Spaatz built. He focused on doctrine, training systems, and civilian oversight structures that would govern nuclear command responsibly across administrations and transitions of power. He chose structural development over hierarchical expansion. He was playing a longer game than any of his critics understood. He understood the greatest danger was insufficient accountability throughout the entire chain of command. Real security came from systems, not symbols. And the most dangerous man in the world also chose to be the most accountable one.